man, we are so fortunate. We are so fortunate to be able to have this space, and I cherish it greatly every single day. And I wanted to sit a little bit longer in this space of building community. We heard a clip from Trevor Noah yesterday that talked about that a notion where the trick of developing nations is that they sort of trick you into feeling like you are successful and you are a part of a developed nation, but then being developed often means abandoning community. And then you end up having to buy community elements in order to replace what you had before you were so sophisticated and developed. And part of building community also sits in, requires us, I should say, to have a healthy understanding of relationships. And because community is a gathering of relationships. And I was watching, a number of items. I was, preparing, sort of searching out for some insight, for inspiration points that I could share with you in the moment of gratitude. And I came across someone who I thought just put this particular point so well. And it's about what you owe. And who owes whom? There was a situation I had recently where I had contracted with a young person to do a job. And I had explained that the job was it was a situation where you were going to get paid in 10 business days. You'd have to submit, paperwork in order to get paid. And because, we needed a W-9 because my shit is official, right? We can't just be giving out. We ain't paying with petty cash. Like I run a nonprofit organization, so we have to have records. And so I explained this at the beginning, and the person, young person, accepted the contract, and we were so excited. And the young person did a great job on the substantive work that was needed for the contract. It was a phenomenal job, actually. My entire team was thrilled. It was wonderful. And then, it took a while for them to submit the paperwork that we needed in order to start that 10 business day cycle. And ultimately, their paperwork didn't get submitted in enough time for the 10 business days to correspond with the actual timing of the project. And so, to me, it was a regular situation. You got the paperwork in later than intended, after you'd even completed the work. So now the 10 business days starts. And to me, in my mind, it was perfectly clear. Not an issue at all. But I learned that it was definitely an issue for this young person. This young person needed that money more than that 10 calendar day recognition was going to help alleviate. And ultimately, reached out, got a little brolic with the reach out and was like, I need my money in 3 days. And it went from being this wonderful situation to where all of a sudden they sent over a list of terms that said they had to be paid by Cash App or Apple Pay within 3 days of the project. And I was like, well, wow. I wish you had said this when we agreed, because had you said this when we agreed, I would have told you that this wasn't going to work for us. We can't do a 3-day turnaround. We're a very traditional nonprofit with an old ass payment structure. So I would have shared with you then that, well, okay, we'll have to go separate ways because we wouldn't be able to do this sort of turnaround. But I began realizing, because it got much more insistent in a way that I was like, something is off. This ain't right. And at a certain point, I had to go back and forth because I began to be irritated. And I was like, well, this is foolish. Clearly we had an understanding as to what was happening. It's not my fault you turned in your W-9 and all this stuff late. And so I was going into a process of my own justification, of my indignation, of how dare you spring all these last minute terms that ain't got nothing to do with what we agree with. And I got indignant. And then I heard a voice inside that said, hold on, Lurie. Hold on. This isn't somebody who obviously has done a lot of work with nonprofits. This isn't somebody who, and I could tell from, when somebody throw together an invoice and you can be like, oh, baby, this is your first time with an invoice, ain't it? Or they put together paperwork and you could be like, oh, you ain't never did this before. And something told me to pause. Because despite the fact that I had been very clear, the reality was this was a young person who was new to business and obviously was desperate in this financial situation. And I could have, because I'm a petty person, the Lord is still working on me, but I could have said, well, screw you, buttercup, suck it up. You should have planned better. But then I went back into my own memory of when I too was struggling financially. And when I too had made some financial decisions that put me in a space of desperation, and as opposed to sitting in a space of, I can't believe, who do they think they are sending me these whack ass terms that clearly ChatGPT put together and didn't even spell it right. And I had to take a pause. Because I realized that even if in my mind I was correct, in this moment, I had an opportunity to be right. And sometimes there's a difference because I recognize, and yes, I know some of you saying, well, it couldn't have been me. That person would have did it. And I said, you know what? There is a level of desperation in the tenor of these messages that speaks louder to me than the rules about what should govern in a contractual relationship. And so I was like, you know what? Hold on. I told my team, stand down, because they was about to pounce. I said, stand down. I went ahead and I just paid them personally, and I can get the reimbursement. I don't need the 10 business days. Like, I can get a reimbursement. It was fine. There was a way to resolve this issue that would allow that person to have their needs met, their very desperate need get met, and would allow me to continue to move on and say, well, of course, we ain't never going to do business together again, but would allow me to operate in a level of integrity that was more in alignment with what my memory of my own desperation was like. And I'm referencing that example because of this quote that I saw from a Threads user by the name of I am IV05. I am IV05 said something that really spoke to me and helped me to sort of find a sense of peace around the entire situation. And I am IV05 said the following quote, "This generation doesn't know how to build healthy relationships. We end up saying stuff like, I don't owe you anything. I don't owe anyone anything. You do owe people something. You owe people you offended an apology. You owe those who gave you support gratitude. You owe those you disrespect respect. Accountability is a personal act of integrity and moral principles. We will forever live in a broken society until we learn to account for our actions that impact other people's lives negatively." Now, in this situation, that's the end of the quote. In this situation, I hadn't done anything wrong in this case. I had clearly laid out what it was. But in this situation, I had more power. I had more experience. I had more expertise. And I didn't have the desperation that they had. And so even though I was correct in what I was expecting to happen, I could recognize that this was a hurting person who had some needs that, had not been articulated, and they were a young person. And this was a moment of desperation that I have not had to experience. Thank God has been good. I haven't been that financially desperate in a very long time. And I could have taken I don't know who you think you are coming at me like this when I done told you what it was going to be. You the one that I could have done that, and I would have been technically correct. But for the purpose of setting an example for this young person, and for the purpose, and I know some of you are thinking, well, the example should have been, they should have got their paperwork together. Pause. Go back to when you were very, very young, trying to be whoever it is you were trying to be, making mistakes along the way, doing the best that you could. It was clear the young person had been taken advantage of before. They were operating out of a space of desperation. Correctness would have allowed me to ignore that. But how do I go around talking about how we have to build community and provide support and stand in the gap for each other when I couldn't do it? And if I couldn't do it in a situation where clearly it wasn't going to bother me, I wasn't desperate for the money, and I had the capacity to make it right. This is one of those moments where you're not necessarily wrong, but there's a better way to be right. And if we are serious about trying to build healthy relationships, healthy community, sometimes a measure of grace and sometimes a measure of, listen, if I was being my most petty self, I would give you the birdie. But I'm trying to be a righteous sister. I'm trying to create a space where we can better rely on each other and not create another reason for a young person to feel like they had been abandoned or wronged. Even if years from now, I'm sure they'll look back on the situation and realize, they played themselves and really played themselves because I'll never hire them again. And I had a whole ass contract. But that's another point. The point is, in that moment, they had a need. And in that moment, the right thing to do was not to say, I don't owe you anything. The right thing to do was to demonstrate to this young person the error of their ways, which I did lovingly via email, because I believe in a paper trail, and explain to them where they went wrong. Pointed out, if you're going to have an invoice, you should do this, that, the other. If you're going to do it here, I pointed it out, but sent them what they needed for them to have peace. Because the last thing I need when there is a position for me to make something right is enmity from somebody who, frankly, is moving through a point of desperation. I don't technically owe that person anything. But because I can move in a spirit of grace and gratitude, it is incumbent upon me to offer them grace and gratitude and to recognize, not necessarily at the surface level, what's right and what's wrong and who is correct, but to do what's necessary to provide a space of healing. Because especially it wasn't going to hurt me. And so we owe those in our community, whether they be correct or not, a measure of respect and human empathy that says, I'm going to see past the surface level of what you are experiencing right now, and I'm going to listen with my third ear. I'm going to see with my third eye, and I'm going to connect with you at a heart space level that will allow me to move in a space of righteousness, even if you don't technically deserve it, because that in that moment was the right thing to do. You may not owe anybody anything in your own mind, but we do owe our community a measure of grace, a measure of support, and a measure of, you know what? I'm willing to give you this one because I can see that your need in this moment is at a level of desperation that my need to be correct does not need to match. That can be a difficult thing to navigate, but it is an important lesson to remember. Sometimes community building is messy. Sometimes it requires those of us who have better access to power, resources, and privilege in that particular moment to take the L, allow them to move on, obviously not work with them again, but allow them to move on so that they are able to do what's necessary for them to get to their next level. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I made a lot of stupid mistakes. And there were a lot of elders who had grace for me in a way that hopefully I was able to provide for this young person. Sometimes community building is messy, but when we do it with a measure of love and empathy, and when we are willing to love us harder than we were taught not to, that is some of the sinew, that is some of the threads that can hold parts of community together that otherwise might be rendered asunder. My friends, I don't know what it is today that gives you a sense of joy or gratitude or appreciation, but whatever it is, I want you to hold on to it, cherish and nourish it, and sprinkle as much of the juicy goodness of it as you possibly can into the lives of other people, because Lord knows we could all use a bit more of it. And that, my friends, is today's moment of gratitude.